How many times can a heart be tested before it stops believing in love? Ethan Brooks used to think the answer was 12. 12 blind dates. 12 hopeful evenings. 12 women who smiled politely when they arrived and disappeared the moment they believed he had nothing to offer except an old pickup truck, a worn denim jacket, and a quiet life devoted to his little girl. He never told them about the company that carried his name across 42 states. He never mentioned the private investment portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He never spoke about the house overlooking the Pacific, or the people who waited for his signature every Monday morning. Instead, he drove the same 15-year-old Ford pickup, wore boots with faded leather, and introduced himself as a maintenance supervisor who worked long hours just to keep food on the table. Every date was the same story, and every ending sounded painfully familiar. The conversation would begin with polite smiles and hopeful questions, then slowly drift toward careers, income, vacations, and dreams measured in dollar signs. Somewhere between dessert and goodbye, disappointment always settled across the table like an unwelcome guest. Ethan never argued. He simply thanked them for their time, drove home beneath quiet streetlights, and reminded himself that pretending to be ordinary was still the fastest way to discover extraordinary character. Waiting at home was the only person whose opinion had ever truly mattered. 8-year-old Lily Brooks would usually be curled up on the living room couch wearing oversized pajamas, pretending she hadn't fallen asleep while waiting for him. Every single time she heard the front door, her sleepy eyes would open just enough to ask the same gentle question. "Did she make you smile, Daddy?" Ethan always smiled back, kissed her forehead, and answered with the same quiet honesty. "Not tonight, sweetheart." Lily never asked why. Children somehow understood heartbreak without needing every detail explained. The next Saturday morning, father and daughter visited Willow Creek Diner, a small roadside restaurant where the coffee smelled rich, the pancakes arrived bigger than the plates, and everybody seemed to know everybody except Ethan. He liked places where no one recognized the billionaire hiding behind tired eyes. As Lily colored pictures with a box of half-used crayons, a young waitress approached carrying 2 glasses of ice water. Her name tag simply read Grace. She smiled first at Lily instead of Ethan. "I love your drawing," she said warmly. "Is that your dad wearing a superhero cape?" Lily giggled. "No. That's just his old jacket." Grace laughed softly, not at them but with them, as though simple moments still mattered more than polished appearances. Ethan noticed something unusual. She never looked at his truck through the window. She never glanced at the worn sleeves of his jacket. She never tried to guess his income, his status, or the balance in his bank account. Instead, she knelt beside Lily, listened carefully as the little girl proudly explained every colorful crayon mark, and somehow made the entire noisy diner feel quieter. For the first time in years, Ethan forgot he was pretending to be broke. For the first time in years, he simply hoped someone might see the man before they ever discovered the millionaire. The waitress returned a few minutes later carrying a plate stacked with blueberry pancakes for Lily and a simple breakfast platter for Ethan. Before setting them down, she looked at Lily with the same warm smile. "I added extra strawberries because somebody told me they make Saturday mornings happier." Lily's eyes widened. "I did not even ask for them." Grace shrugged gently. "Sometimes kindness does not wait to be asked." Ethan watched the exchange in silence. It had been years since he had seen someone pay attention to his daughter before trying to impress him. Most people smiled at Lily because they wanted Ethan to notice. Grace noticed Lily because that was simply who she was. The diner slowly filled with the familiar rhythm of weekend life. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Country music drifted softly from an old speaker near the kitchen. Outside, sunlight stretched across Main Street, catching the chrome bumpers of parked pickup trucks and family sedans. It was an ordinary morning in a town where people still waved to strangers and remembered birthdays. Ethan had always loved places like this because they reminded him of the life he had before success complicated everything. Years earlier, long before magazine covers and boardroom presentations, he and his late wife, Hannah, had spent countless Saturday mornings in little diners exactly like this one. They had promised each other that no matter how successful life became, they would never measure people by the size of their homes or the numbers in their bank accounts. Hannah believed that character revealed itself in ordinary moments. She often said that anyone could look generous when cameras were watching, but true kindness usually happened where nobody applauded. After she passed away from a long illness, those words became Ethan's compass. The fortune he eventually built gave Lily every opportunity a father could hope to provide, yet it also attracted people who admired everything except the man himself. One evening, after another disappointing dinner with someone who spent more time discussing luxury vacations than family, Ethan had stood alone in his office overlooking the city skyline. He remembered taking off his expensive watch, placing it inside a desk drawer, and making himself a quiet promise. From that day forward, every blind date would begin with the truth about his heart instead of the truth about his wealth. If someone walked away because they believed he was ordinary, then they had saved both of them years of disappointment. It was never a game. It was protection for the fragile hope he still carried. Across the diner, Grace helped an elderly couple settle into their favorite booth by the window. She remembered exactly how Mr. Henderson liked his coffee, black with 1 teaspoon of sugar, and she quietly placed an extra napkin beside Mrs. Henderson before the older woman even realized she needed one. There was no performance in her kindness. She moved through the dining room with calm confidence, making every customer feel seen without asking for recognition. Lily watched her with admiration. "Daddy," she whispered, leaning closer across the table. "She smiles like Mom used to." Ethan froze for the briefest moment. His coffee suddenly tasted different. Not because Lily had compared anyone to Hannah, but because the comparison came from innocence rather than replacement. He looked toward Grace again. She was laughing softly as she helped a young boy clean spilled orange juice from the table, reassuring his embarrassed mother that accidents happened every day. There was patience in her voice. There was grace in the way she carried herself, almost as though her name had quietly shaped her life. When Grace returned to refill Ethan's coffee, she noticed him staring out the window. "Everything all right?" she asked. Ethan smiled politely. "Just thinking. Good thoughts, I hope." He looked at Lily, who was happily arranging strawberries into the shape of a heart on her plate. "The best kind." Grace nodded as though she understood more than he had actually said. She did not ask about his career. She did not ask whether he owned a home or rented an apartment. She simply wished them a wonderful weekend before moving to another table. Ethan lowered his eyes to his coffee cup. Somewhere deep inside, something he had spent years carefully protecting had shifted almost imperceptibly. For the first time since Hannah was gone, hope no longer felt like something dangerous. It felt like something quietly waiting to be discovered. The following Saturday arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky painted in soft shades of blue. Ethan told himself he had simply come back because Lily loved the blueberry pancakes, but even he did not believe the excuse anymore. The little girl bounced out of the pickup truck holding the same sketchbook she carried everywhere, her smile brighter than the morning sun. As they stepped inside Willow Creek Diner, the familiar scent of fresh biscuits, maple syrup, and brewed coffee wrapped around them like an old memory. Before either of them reached their usual booth, Grace looked up from the register and smiled with genuine surprise. "Well, look who came back." Lily hurried toward her. "I finished my drawing." Grace knelt beside her without worrying about the growing line of customers waiting to be seated. "Can I see?" Lily proudly opened the sketchbook. The first page showed a little diner beneath colorful autumn trees. A smiling waitress stood beside a father and daughter, all holding oversized pancakes. Grace laughed softly, covering her heart for a moment. "I think you made me look prettier than I really am." Lily shook her head. "Daddy says drawings are supposed to show how people make you feel." Grace looked toward Ethan. He offered an embarrassed smile but said nothing. She carefully closed the sketchbook and handed it back. "That might be the sweetest thing anyone has said to me all year." As they settled into the booth, Grace poured fresh coffee without asking whether Ethan wanted any. Somehow she had already remembered. "You remembered?" Ethan said with quiet surprise. She smiled while setting down the mug. Some people order food. Some people order routines. You look like the routine kind. Ethan chuckled for the first time in longer than he could remember. That obvious? Only if someone pays attention. Those simple words lingered in his mind long after she walked away. Throughout breakfast, the diner grew busier than usual. A family celebrating a birthday filled one corner, while several ranchers gathered near the counter discussing weather forecasts and football scores. Every few minutes, Grace moved from table to table with calm confidence, greeting each customer by name whenever she could. She remembered favorite meals, asked about grandchildren, and somehow made every conversation feel personal even while balancing heavy trays. Ethan noticed something else. Whenever the kitchen became overwhelmed, Grace quietly stepped behind the counter to help refill drinks or clear dishes without waiting to be asked. There was no complaint in her voice and no frustration on her face. She simply did whatever needed to be done. Lily noticed it too. She works harder than anybody, she whispered. Ethan nodded. Some people lead without telling anyone they are leading. A few moments later, an elderly man entered using a cane. Before anyone else reacted, Grace walked across the dining room, held the door open, and guided him safely to his favorite booth near the fireplace. She did not rush him. She did not glance impatiently at the waiting customers. She simply matched his pace one careful step at a time. The old man smiled gratefully. You always make me feel like I still matter. Grace squeezed his shoulder gently. You have always mattered, Mr. Wilkins. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his coffee. Wealth had introduced him to executives, celebrities, and powerful investors, but kindness like this could never be purchased. It had to be lived every single day. After breakfast, Lily excused herself to look at the small bookshelf near the entrance where children could borrow books while waiting for meals. Grace joined her and recommended a story about a brave little fox who believed every stranger deserved a chance to become a friend. Lily hugged the book tightly. Can Daddy read it tonight? Grace smiled. I think that would make both of you happy. Ethan walked over to pay the check, reaching into his worn wallet. Grace quietly placed the receipt on the counter. The pie is on me today. Ethan looked up with surprise. You really do not have to do that. She shrugged gently. I know. That is why I wanted to. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. Would you maybe like to have coffee somewhere when you are not working? Grace blinked, clearly caught off guard, then looked toward Lily, who suddenly became very interested in the fox book she was pretending to read. A soft smile slowly appeared across Grace's face. Coffee sounds nice, she answered. As long as your little partner approves. Lily looked up immediately. I definitely approve. For reasons neither of them could fully explain, the quiet little diner suddenly felt warmer than it had only a few moments before, and outside the old pickup truck waited beneath golden maple trees, carrying with it the first fragile beginning of something neither heart had expected to find. 3 evenings later, Ethan parked his old pickup outside a quiet neighborhood coffee shop a few blocks away from the diner. It was the kind of place with warm yellow lights, handmade pastries, and bookshelves lining the walls instead of large television screens. Grace arrived wearing a simple navy sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back, looking almost surprised that someone had invited her somewhere without expecting anything in return. Lily had insisted on staying with Ethan's older sister for the evening because, as she proudly explained, every grown-up deserves one chance to drink coffee without a third grader interrupting. Grace laughed when Ethan shared the story. Your daughter is wiser than most adults I know. They talked for nearly 2 hours, but not once did the conversation drift toward money, careers, or social status. Grace spoke about growing up in Willow Creek, helping her mother after her father passed away, and working double shifts so her mother could comfortably retire one day. Ethan listened carefully, offering only pieces of his own carefully edited story. He spoke about raising Lily alone, missing his late wife every single day, and taking whatever jobs he could find to give his daughter a stable childhood. None of it was entirely false. He simply left out the chapters that involved boardrooms, private aircraft, and billion-dollar contracts. As they walked toward the parking lot, A chilly breeze swept through the maple trees, carrying bright orange leaves across the sidewalk. Grace noticed Ethan rubbing his hands together and smiled. Winter always arrives earlier than people expect around here. Ethan looked at the fading sunlight. Some seasons teach us to appreciate warmth more than others. She nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that is true about people too. During the following weeks, seeing each other slowly became part of their routine. Sometimes Grace joined Ethan and Lily for walks through the town park after finishing her shift. Other evenings they shared homemade soup at Grace's modest house where her mother, Margaret Turner, welcomed them with genuine hospitality and stories about the town from decades earlier. Lily quickly grew attached to Margaret, who always baked fresh oatmeal cookies before every visit. Ethan noticed that the small home needed repairs. The porch railing leaned slightly, one of the kitchen cabinet doors no longer closed properly, and the backyard fence had clearly survived one too many winters. Without making a speech about it, Ethan quietly returned the following Saturday carrying a toolbox in the back of his old pickup. I had a free afternoon, he said casually. I thought maybe these old hinges deserved a second chance. Grace smiled with amused disbelief. You really cannot sit still, can you? He shrugged. Fixing things helps me think. They spent the afternoon replacing loose boards, tightening screws, and repainting part of the porch while Lily and Margaret planted autumn flowers near the front steps. It felt less like work and more like family discovering its rhythm. As the sun lowered behind the trees, Grace handed Ethan a glass of homemade lemonade. You should have let me pay you. Ethan shook his head with the same gentle smile he had worn the day he fixed nothing more than a loose hinge. Some things are worth more when nobody pays for them. Grace studied him quietly. You always say things that sound simple, but they stay with people. Before Ethan could answer, his old pickup refused to start. He turned the key again. The engine coughed weakly before falling silent. He tried once more with the same result. Grace frowned with concern instead of embarrassment. That truck has been trying to tell you something for a long time. Ethan laughed softly. It has been saying that for years. Without hesitation, Grace disappeared inside the house and returned carrying a small envelope. She extended it toward him. Ethan looked confused. What is this? A little help, she answered gently. You have done enough for my family. Please let me help yours. Ethan did not even open the envelope. He slowly pushed it back toward her. I cannot take your savings. Grace blinked. How did you know it was my savings? He smiled kindly. Because people who work as hard as you do never carry extra cash unless it matters. She lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly admitting. I thought maybe your truck was the only thing standing between you and getting Lily everywhere she needs to go. Ethan looked toward his old pickup sitting beneath the fading afternoon sky. He had access to luxury vehicles worth more than most houses, yet the woman standing in front of him believed he truly needed help and still offered what little she had without expecting anything in return. In that quiet moment, surrounded by falling leaves and weathered porch boards, Ethan realized that Grace had unknowingly passed the one test she had never known existed. I woke before sunrise the next morning with something unusual resting on my heart. It was not fear, and it was not excitement. It was responsibility. For years I had convinced myself that hiding my wealth protected my future, but now another question refused to leave me alone. What if the disguise that once protected my heart eventually became the very thing that wounded someone who had done nothing to deserve it? Ethan stood quietly in his kitchen while coffee slowly filled his favorite ceramic mug. Outside the window, the first rays of morning stretched across the trees surrounding his home. From the outside, the modest house appeared no different from countless others in the neighborhood. It was one of several properties he quietly maintained for moments, when he wanted life to feel ordinary. Upstairs, Lily came running down the stairs carrying the Fox storybook Grace had recommended weeks earlier. Daddy, she said with sleepy excitement, can we bring Mrs. Turner some pumpkin muffins today? Aunt Claire taught me how to make them. Ethan smiled. I think she would like that very much. Lily paused before taking a bite of toast. Grace looked worried yesterday. Ethan nodded slowly. She was trying to help us. Lily tilted her head. She thought we needed help. Yes. Are we going to tell her? Ethan looked out the window for several long seconds. Not yet. Lily accepted the answer, but children often notice the emotions adults tried hardest to hide. Mom always said secrets get heavier the longer people carry them. Those simple words followed Ethan throughout the entire morning. At the office downtown, another version of his life quietly waited behind polished glass walls and carefully scheduled meetings. Before entering the building, he removed the faded denim jacket from the passenger seat and replaced it with a tailored navy suit stored inside a garment bag. The transformation took less than 2 minutes. The same man who repaired porch railings on Saturday now stepped into the headquarters of Brooks Horizon Holdings, where hundreds of employees greeted him respectfully as Chief Executive Officer. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. The board is waiting in Conference Room 1. Your New York investors joined by video 5 minutes ago. Ethan answered every greeting with the same calm humility he carried everywhere else. Success had never impressed him nearly as much as character. During the quarterly meeting, executives discussed expansion plans, charitable investments, and a proposed scholarship program for children who had lost one parent. Ethan listened carefully before quietly approving the initiative. If we are fortunate enough to build something valuable, he said, then we should also build opportunities for families who need hope. Around the table, several executives nodded with admiration. None of them realized that the scholarship proposal reminded Ethan of Lily every single time he read it. After the meeting, his longtime assistant, Daniel Mercer, handed him a folder containing invitations to charity galas, television interviews, and business awards. Ethan glanced through them before setting the folder aside. Please decline the interviews. Daniel smiled knowingly. You have declined every interview for almost 5 years. Ethan returned the smile. Nothing has changed. Daniel hesitated before asking carefully. Except maybe something has. Ethan looked up. What do you mean? Daniel had worked beside him long enough to recognize subtle differences others never noticed. You have been leaving the office earlier every Friday. Ethan laughed softly. I have been spending more time with Lily. Daniel nodded politely, although he suspected there was another reason. He chose not to ask. Respect sometimes meant allowing silence to remain undisturbed. That evening Ethan changed back into his worn boots and old jacket before driving toward Willow Creek. As always, he parked a short distance away from the diner. Grace was finishing her shift when she stepped outside carrying a small paper bag. I saved something for Lily, she said. The bakery accidentally made 1 extra cinnamon roll this morning. Ethan accepted the bag gratefully. She is going to think you are her favorite person. Grace smiled. I think she already decided that weeks ago. They began walking slowly along the quiet sidewalk while golden leaves drifted through the cool evening air. Families strolled past carrying grocery bags. Children rode bicycles beneath streetlights that had just begun to glow. It was the kind of small American town where conversations still happened on front porches instead of behind locked doors. Grace glanced toward Ethan with quiet curiosity. Can I ask you something? Of course. You never complain. Ethan laughed. I am sure I do sometimes. She shook her head. Not really. Your truck breaks down. You smile. Work keeps you busy. You smile. Life clearly has not been easy, but you still make other people feel comfortable. How? Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. Because I learned that peace is not something you find after life becomes perfect. It is something you practice while life is still imperfect. Grace looked ahead for several moments without speaking. Your wife must have been a remarkable woman. Ethan's smile softened. She was. Grace nodded gently. I wish I could have met her. You would have liked each other. I think I would have. Silence settled comfortably between them. It was not an awkward silence. It was the kind shared by people who no longer felt pressure to impress one another. As they reached Grace's car, she turned toward Ethan. I have been thinking about yesterday. About the truck? About you refusing my savings, Ethan answered quietly. I could never take something you worked so hard to earn. Grace folded her arms against the evening chill. Do you know what surprised me the most? What? Most people spend their lives hoping someone will rescue them. You spend your life making sure nobody sacrifices for you. Ethan looked into her kind eyes and realized the truth frightened him more than ever before. Grace was not falling in love with a millionaire. She was slowly falling in love with a man she believed had almost nothing except honesty, quiet strength, and a daughter who adored him. For the first time since Hannah had passed away, Ethan found himself praying for a future that suddenly felt possible. At the very same moment, he feared that future more than any business risk he had ever faced, because companies could recover from mistakes, fortunes could be rebuilt, but the trust of a truly good heart, once broken, might never return the same way again. The following Friday began like every other day, quiet, ordinary, and carefully balanced between two completely different lives. Ethan dropped Lily off at school with a warm hug and watched her disappear through the front doors carrying the Fox storybook beneath one arm. Do not forget, she reminded him before running inside. Mrs. Turner invited us for dinner tomorrow. Ethan smiled. I would not miss it. He climbed into the old pickup and drove away, never noticing a black luxury sedan parked across the street. Inside sat a financial reporter named Victoria Sloan, who had spent 3 days trying to understand why one of America's most private business leaders kept disappearing every weekend without security or assistance. She had followed him only because a charity foundation hoped to feature him in an upcoming article about anonymous philanthropy. She expected to find another executive hiding inside a luxury resort or private club. Instead, she watched him disappear into a quiet small town where nobody seemed to recognize him. Victoria frowned with curiosity and quietly instructed the driver to keep a respectful distance. Later that afternoon, Grace finished her shift at Willow Creek Diner just as the lunch crowd began to thin. The familiar rhythm of clinking dishes and cheerful conversations slowly settled into peaceful silence. She was wiping down the counter when Mr. Henderson, one of the regular customers, unfolded the local newspaper. Suddenly he adjusted his glasses and looked twice at the front page of the business section. Well now, he murmured. That fellow looks strangely familiar. Grace smiled while pouring him fresh coffee. Who does? He turned the paper toward her. A large photograph showed Ethan wearing the same navy suit he had worn during the board meeting earlier that week. Behind him stood the headquarters of Brooks Horizon Holdings beneath a headline that read, Private Billionaire expands national scholarship program for single-parent families. Grace stared without blinking. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. Beneath the photograph she recognized the same gentle eyes, the same quiet expression, and the same man who insisted he repaired porch railings because he enjoyed fixing things. She read the first paragraph once. Then again more slowly. Founder. Chief Executive Officer. Estimated fortune exceeding $1 billion. National business leader. Quiet philanthropist. Father of one daughter. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she lowered the newspaper onto the counter. Mr. Henderson noticed the change in her expression. You know him? Grace answered almost automatically. I thought I did. She quietly removed her apron and asked another waitress to cover the remainder of her shift. The short drive home felt strangely longer than usual. Every conversation she had shared with Ethan replayed inside her mind with painful clarity. The old pickup truck. The simple clothes. The stories about working long hours. The evenings spent repairing her mother's porch. None of those moments had been fake. Yet one enormous truth had remained hidden behind every smile. Across town, Ethan finished another meeting before changing back into his familiar denim jacket. Daniel noticed the folded newspaper resting on the conference table. It seems the foundation released your story earlier than expected, he said. Ethan glanced at the article without concern. That is fine. It only mentions the scholarship program. Then his expression slowly changed. Willow Creek received that newspaper every Friday afternoon. The color quietly faded from his face. Without another word, he grabbed his truck keys and left the building. The drive toward the diner felt longer than it ever had before. Autumn rain began falling gently across the windshield, turning the streets silver beneath the evening light. By the time he reached Grace's house, the porch lights were already glowing. He stepped onto the front porch carrying the pumpkin muffins Lily had baked that morning. Grace opened the door almost immediately. She was calm, but her eyes carried a sadness Ethan had never seen before. Either of them spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Grace looked at the paper folded neatly on the entry table behind her. "You once told me peace comes from living honestly while life is imperfect." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I remember." Grace nodded slowly. Her voice remained gentle, but every word landed heavily between them. "Then tell me, Ethan, which part of your life was honest, and which part was only for me to believe?" Rain continued to fall softly between them, each drop tapping against the porch roof with quiet persistence. Ethan remained where he stood, the paper bag of pumpkin muffins still resting in his hands. Grace looked at it for a long moment before gently taking the bag from him and placing it on the small table beside the front door. It was such a simple gesture, yet somehow it felt as though she had carefully set down everything they had been building together. Ethan finally spoke. "Almost everything I told you is true." Grace looked into his eyes without anger. "Almost?" He nodded slowly. "I really do miss Hannah every day. Lily truly is the center of my world. I really do enjoy fixing things. I meant every conversation we ever had." Grace folded her arms, not to protect herself from him but from the cold evening air that suddenly seemed much heavier than before. "And the part about barely getting by?" Ethan lowered his eyes. "That was the part one never corrected." Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Ethan remained silent. "It is not the money." Her voice stayed calm, but every word carried quiet disappointment. "It is realizing that every time I tried to help you, every time I worried about you, every time I prayed that things would get easier for you, you already knew none of those worries were real." Ethan took one careful step forward. "My feelings for you were always real." Grace nodded gently. "I believe that." His eyes lifted with a trace of hope, but it disappeared when she continued. "The problem is that you never believed mine." Those words settled between them more heavily than the rain. Ethan searched for an answer that would somehow repair what had been broken, but none came. After several moments he quietly said, "I spent years meeting people who cared more about my bank account than my heart. I convinced myself that hiding my success was the only way to protect Lily and myself." Grace listened without interrupting. "Then I met you," he continued. "Every day I wanted to tell you the truth. Every day it became harder because every day I cared more about losing you." Grace looked toward the quiet street where yellow reflections shimmered across the wet pavement. "Do you know what I would have done if you had told me on our second date?" Ethan shook his head. "I probably would have laughed, and told you that I still expected you to help paint my mother's porch." A faint smile almost appeared on both their faces before fading again. "But at least," Grace whispered, "I would have been choosing the truth." Inside the house, Margaret quietly watched through the kitchen window without saying a word. She understood that some conversations belonged only to the people living them. Upstairs, the old clock chimed 7 times, filling the silence with gentle echoes. Ethan finally spoke again. "I never wanted to test you." Grace looked back at him with kind but tired eyes. "Maybe not at first. But somewhere along the way, that is exactly what happened. You were waiting to discover whether I loved you for the right reasons while I never even knew there was an examination." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. She was right. What had begun as protection had slowly become judgment disguised as caution. The realization hurt because it was true. Grace reached for the doorknob but paused before opening it. "Lily has done nothing wrong. I know. Please do not let her think this is somehow her fault." Ethan nodded immediately. "Never." Grace smiled sadly. "She is one of the brightest lights I have ever known. She loves you." Grace swallowed quietly before answering. "I love her too." The words were spoken with such natural honesty that Ethan felt his heart tighten. Nothing about Grace's kindness had ever depended on money. Nothing about her affection for Lily had ever been part of a fantasy about wealth. It had all been genuine from the beginning. "I need some time," Grace said softly. "Not because you are wealthy." She looked directly into his eyes. "Because I need to remember which memories belong to us and which ones belong to the secret you carried." Ethan accepted her words without argument. "Take all the time you need." Grace gave one final nod before stepping inside and quietly closing the door. Ethan remained on the porch for another minute, listening to the gentle rain and staring at the warm light shining through the front windows. For the first time in many years, he realized that losing someone's trust was far more painful than losing any fortune he had ever built. As he slowly walked back toward the old pickup, he understood that no amount of success could solve this moment. Only humility, patience, and truth could, and even then there were no guarantees that the heart waiting on the other side of that front door would ever fully believe him again. The days that followed settled into an unfamiliar silence. Ethan kept his promise, and did not call Grace or appear unexpectedly at the diner. Every evening he drove past Willow Creek from a distance, never stopping, never hoping she might accidentally see him. Some lessons could not be rushed, and some wounds needed the dignity of space before they could begin to heal. At home, Lily sensed the change almost immediately. One evening as they finished washing dinner dishes together, she looked up at her father and quietly asked, "Did you and Grace have a sad conversation?" Ethan stopped drying a plate. Children often asked the questions adults feared the most because they asked them without judgment. He knelt beside his daughter and smiled gently. "We did." Lily studied his face. "Was it because of the newspaper?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." She remained quiet for a long moment before wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Mom used to say that telling the truth late is still better than never telling it at all." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. Hannah's wisdom had somehow found its way into their daughter's heart. "Your mom was a very wise woman." Across town, Grace tried to return to ordinary life, but ordinary no longer felt the same. Customers still filled the diner every morning. Coffee still brewed before sunrise. The old jukebox still played familiar country songs during breakfast. Yet every time the front door opened, a small part of her expected to see Ethan smiling awkwardly beside his old pickup jacket, with Lily rushing and carrying another drawing. The empty booth by the window quietly reminded her that absence could speak as loudly as presence. One afternoon Margaret found Grace sitting alone on the back porch after work, staring across the yard where the autumn flowers Ethan had planted continued to bloom. "You miss them," Margaret said softly. Grace did not deny it. "I miss the people I believed I knew." Margaret sat beside her, folding her hands comfortably in her lap. "Do you believe he cared about you?" Grace answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Do you believe he cared about Lily?" Grace smiled faintly. "More than anyone." Margaret nodded. "Then perhaps the question is not whether he loved honestly. Perhaps the question is whether fear convinced him that honesty was too dangerous." Grace remained silent. Her mother continued gently. "Fear has a strange way of making good people choose complicated paths." The words lingered with Grace long after the conversation ended. The following Saturday morning Lily asked her father if they could deliver homemade soup to the community shelter where they volunteered once each month. Ethan immediately agreed. They spent the morning serving meals, carrying trays, and sitting with elderly guests who simply appreciated someone willing to listen. Ethan noticed Lily quietly giving away the homemade cookies she had packed for herself. "I thought those were your favorite," he said. Lily smiled. "They looked happier than I would be with them." Ethan felt an unexpected warmth settle over his heart. Grace had not been the only person teaching Lily about quiet generosity. That afternoon, as Ethan and Lily loaded empty containers back into the pickup, they were surprised to see Margaret Turner walking toward them with a reusable grocery bag in one hand. Lily ran forward first. "Mrs. Turner!" Margaret hugged her warmly. "I thought I might find you two here." Ethan greeted her respectfully. "It is good to see you." Margaret smiled kindly before handing him a neatly folded envelope. "Grace asked me not to bring this." Ethan looked confused. "Then why did you?" "Because mothers sometimes ignore instructions when they think hope deserves another chance." Ethan slowly opened the envelope. Inside was the small amount of savings Grace had once offered to help repair his truck. Along with it rested a handwritten note. It contained only one sentence. "I do not want you to carry this because of guilt any more than I wanted you to carry it because of pride." Ethan read the sentence twice before carefully folding the paper again. Margaret watched him quietly. "She has not stopped caring," she said. "She has simply been trying to understand whether trust can grow again after disappointment." Ethan looked toward the shelter where volunteers continued greeting every visitor with warm smiles. "I am willing to wait as long as it takes." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good. Because love that lasts is rarely built by grand gestures. It is usually rebuilt one honest day at a time." As she walked away, Lily slipped her small hand into her father's. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart?" She looked up with the calm certainty only children sometimes possess. "I think Grace already knows who you really are now." Ethan smiled sadly. "I hope so." Lily shook her head. "No." She squeezed his hand a little tighter. "I do not mean the billionaire. I mean you." Winter arrived gently in Willow Creek, covering rooftops with a light blanket of snow that softened every street and every memory. Nearly 3 months had passed since the evening Ethan stood on Grace's porch holding a bag of pumpkin muffins and a heart full of regret. During those months he never tried to persuade her with expensive gifts, dramatic speeches, or grand displays of wealth. Instead, he simply continued living the values he had always claimed mattered most. Every Saturday he and Lily volunteered at the community shelter. Every Tuesday they delivered groceries to elderly neighbors who could no longer drive. Every Friday Ethan quietly funded scholarships through anonymous donations without allowing his name to appear anywhere. His fortune remained enormous, but he no longer hid behind it, nor did he place it between himself and other people. One crisp Saturday morning the town gathered for the annual Winter Hope Festival held in the old community square. Families wandered among handmade craft booths while children laughed around a towering Christmas tree decorated with thousands of white lights. Local musicians played familiar holiday songs, and the scent of cinnamon, roasted pecans, and hot chocolate drifted through the cold afternoon air. Lily tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, look!" Ethan turned toward the volunteer tent near the center of the square. Grace stood there wearing a simple winter coat over her familiar diner apron, serving steaming bowls of homemade soup to anyone who stopped by. She looked exactly the same, yet somehow stronger, calmer, as though the difficult months had quietly refined her heart instead of hardening it. Grace noticed them almost immediately. Her eyes met Ethan's for the first time in weeks. Either of them spoke. Lily smiled brightly and hurried over first. "I miss you," she said as she wrapped her arms around Grace. Grace hugged her tightly. "I miss you too, sweetheart." Ethan approached more slowly. "Hello, Grace." She smiled softly. "Hello, Ethan." There was no anger left in her voice. Only honesty. For a few moments they worked side by side serving soup, passing bread, and greeting neighbors as though kindness itself had become their conversation. Eventually the line grew shorter until only the three of them remained beneath the warm lights of the tent. Grace reached beneath the table and picked up a small paper bag. "I made cinnamon rolls this morning," she said with a faint smile. "I remembered somebody likes extra icing." Lily laughed happily. "You remembered?" Grace looked toward Ethan. "Some routines are worth remembering." Ethan smiled, then carefully reached into his coat pocket. Grace's expression grew cautious for only a moment before he placed a small object on the table. It was not a jewelry box. It was not an expensive gift. It was the old truck key she had once teased him about. "I sold the pickup last month," he said quietly. Grace looked surprised. "You loved that truck?" Ethan nodded. "I did. but I realized I had started loving the disguise more than the truth. I do not need it anymore. Grace looked at the worn key resting between them before lifting her eyes to meet his. Who are you now? Ethan answered without hesitation. A father who still misses his wife. A man who made a painful mistake because fear became louder than trust. Someone who hopes forgiveness is possible but understands it cannot be demanded. Silence settled gently around them as snowflakes drifted through the evening lights. Grace finally reached across the table, not for the key, but for Ethan's hand. I never needed you to be poor, she whispered. I only needed you to believe I could love the truth. Ethan nodded, emotion filling his eyes. I believe it now. Grace smiled through quiet tears. Good. Because I am not choosing a billionaire. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. I am choosing the man who repaired my mother's porch without expecting anything back, who taught Lily that kindness is never wasted, and who finally trusted me enough to stand here exactly as he is. Lily grinned from ear to ear before slipping her small hands into both of theirs. Around them the town countdown began as thousands of Christmas lights illuminated the square at once. The crowd applauded, children laughed, and joyful music filled the winter air. Yet for Ethan, Grace, and Lily, the brightest moment came not from the lights above them but from the quiet truth between them. Wealth had opened countless doors throughout Ethan's life, but it was honesty that finally brought him home. And in the end, the greatest fortune he ever received was never measured in dollars. It was measured in trust freely given, grace freely offered, and a family built not on what one person owned, but on who they chose to become.